We are getting started this morning with our lesson, and I just kind of want to get a caveat. This is my first time teaching from these Bible Studies for Life. I guess the young adults has redone their books, and it's a little bit different. I mean, not completely different, but I do rely a lot on the commentary for when I teach, and it is different. So if you find me struggling or stumbling a little bit, I'm just getting used to it. Eventually I'll be there. But so today we're still in the sessions of talking about being able to speak truth boldly, and we are still talking about Daniel. And last week we talked about how he interpreted those dreams from Nebuchadnezzar, and then this week he is still with a king. It is not King Nebuchadnezzar anymore, but it is King Belshazzar. And once again, he has to interpret something for the king. And today we're going to be talking about being a bold witness for God, even when it means having to speak some hard truths, even when the truth is not always pretty. So as we get started, I'm going to have Laura read our Bible Meets Life.
On June 4th, 1940, Winston Churchill delivered what became the best-known speech of his life. He declared, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Churchill had the task of delivering truth when truth wasn't necessarily what the people wanted to hear. In a similar way, Christians are called to speak against popular notions of the day.
All right, so I'm sure that having to go to war and fight and never surrendering is probably not what the people of England wanted to hear when Winston Churchill was speaking, but that he knew that was what he had to say, and he knew that even though people weren't going to like it, it still needed to be said. And a lot of times as Christians today, a lot of times we have to say those things that may not seem popular, that may seem a little bit hard to others, but in order to really show that love of God, sometimes we do have to do that tough love. So like I said, we will be talking about Daniel today. And so like I said, Daniel he's still there. There's a new king in power, Belshazzar. But Daniel still remained there, and he still remained faithfully serving God. And once again, he would have to choose where his allegiances lie. So did they lie with the king, who was in power, who was kind of keeping him captive, or did they lie with God? As we talked about last week, decades earlier, King Nebuchadnezzar had carried off some of the sacred vessels from the temple of God when he overtook Jerusalem. So when he overtook Jerusalem, King Nebuchadnezzar had taken some of these things from the temple of God, and now Belshazzar was in possession of these things, and he was having a party. And he had chosen to use these vessels as part of the celebration. But he wasn't having like a church celebration or a homecoming or something going on. He was having a party where there was a lot of debauchery going on. They were like using these things for very sacrilegious type things. But all of a sudden, and I think this would break up any party, the party broke up when a disembodied hand appeared and wrote a mysterious message on the wall. So I don't know about you guys, but I'd be getting out of there if something like that happened. The king called for someone to interpret the inscription, and the queen recommended Daniel. So John, will you read that first set of verses for us?
Then Daniel was brought before the king. The king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the Judean exiles that my predecessor the king brought from Judah? I've heard that you have the spirit of the gods in you, and that insight, intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom are found within you. Now the wise men and mediums were brought before me to read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not give its interpretation. However, I have heard about you, and you can give interpretations and solve problems. Therefore, if you can read this inscription and give me its interpretation, you will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around your neck, and have the third highest position in the kingdom."
All right. So one thing I thought was interesting, I told you guys I always listen to that podcast that Cotton says is no good, but I actually think it's pretty decent. is that, you've heard the phrase, the writing's on the wall. You've heard that phrase a lot, like they saw the writing on the wall. Supposedly it came from this. And a lot of times when you say, like, I saw the writing on the wall, that means it was like something unstoppable. It wasn't something that you saw what was going to happen, and so you chose a different path or whatever. You knew that something was going to happen. So they kind of said that this is where that came from, because what Daniel ultimately interprets this to be is something that's unstoppable. It's not something that Belshazzar is going to be able to do anything about. It's the writing on the wall. It's going to happen. So with each one of these this time, there's kind of each set of verses is going to give you a connection to the point of the lesson today. And so once again, the point of the whole lesson today is that sometimes being a bold witness for God, we have to speak those hard truths. And so you will see as we go through and talking about these verses is that Daniel never... The connection to the point is that the reason that he had this reputation for integrity and this wisdom is because he never wavered in his commitment to God, no matter what kind of circumstances he was put in. And that gave him that reputation for being truthful and not being afraid to speak those hard truths. So the first thing it points out is that Belshazzar obviously didn't really know who Daniel was, even though Daniel had been here captive 66 years. And he's probably like in his late 80s at this point. He says, "Are you Daniel?" And so it kind of shows that he wasn't really acquainted with Daniel. He didn't actually know who he was. But anyway, he then, he says, he kind of recognizes him as one of the exiles. And then he says, even though he doesn't know who he is, he's been told about him. He says that I've heard that you have the spirits of God in you. So what Belshazzar is implying there is that Daniel has exhibited extraordinary abilities that were gifts from God. Just like with Nebuchadnezzar, all these people, mediums, wise men, people they considered wise men, have been brought to try to interpret the dream for Nebuchadnezzar and now this inscription, and nobody can figure out what it means. And so he's heard about this, and he's recognizing that these abilities that Daniel have are a gift from God. And he says that that he recognizes some traits in Daniel, so insight, intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom. So not really being personally acquainted with Daniel, Belshazzar stated what he had heard about. So first of all, insight involves illumination from the gods, or in this case, the one true God in whom light dwells. So he's saying that he knows that he's getting this insight from God. He's not doing this himself. And then intelligence is not mere intellect, but the ability to use it rightly, which I thought was really eye-opening. We call people intelligent a lot, but a lot of people are very smart and know a lot of things, but they don't use it. And he's saying that Daniel has this intellect from God and that he also uses it. And then he tells him that he has extraordinary wisdom, which involves a supernatural ability to interpret dreams and visions, as we knew about from Nebuchadnezzar. And so Belshazzar was looking for this explanation of the words. He didn't want somebody just to tell him what it said. He wanted to understand what this message was. Obviously, the disembodied hand comes out and starts writing something on a wall. It's not just about the words, it's about what the words mean. And so even if the wise men could read the words on the wall, they could not figure them out. So once again, he had gone to mediums, wise men. They couldn't interpret them. The words made no sense. But Daniel did have this reputation for his ability to interpret supernatural phenomena. He also had a reputation for being very open and honest about what it meant. He wasn't going to try to sugarcoat anything. So not only did the king know or had heard that Daniel could interpret it, he also had heard that he would be very honest with the king about it. And then he tells him, if you can figure this out for me, if you can give me this meaning, this interpretation, that he would be clothed in purple, they'd put a gold chain around his neck, and he'd be given the third highest position in the kingdom. And purple, as we know, was the color of royalty. Still kind of represents that, but back in the day it was very extremely expensive. And it could have been something that actually even belonged to Belshazzar himself that he was going to allow Daniel to have. And then a gold chain around the neck was an item that only persons of rank were allowed to wear, and then only if it had been given by the king. And then Belshazzar could only promise this third highest position in the kingdom because he himself was number 2 to Nebuchadnezzar, who was actually his father. So he was giving him the position right underneath him. So, I mean, he could not really promise him any higher other position. There's lots of reasons as what this could possibly mean. That it would mean that they would, like, the 3 of them would rule the kingdom jointly, or it could mean that, like, they were going to divide up the areas into 3 and each of them was going to have a different area, but it didn't really matter. It just these were the things that he was going to offer him. He was going to give him all these great things if he could interpret this inscription for him. So as we move on to the next set of verses, we'll see that the importance of speaking the truth, that sin involves exalting ourselves over God. So, Lori, if you'll read the next set of verses.
Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts and give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription for the king and make the interpretation known to him. But you, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Instead, you have exalted yourself against the Lord of the heavens. The vessels from his house were brought to you, and as you and your nobles, wives, and concubines drank wine from them, you praised the gods made of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or understand. But you have not glorified the God who holds your life breath in his hand and who controls the whole course of your life."
All right. So once again, Daniel is very much, he has a commitment to speaking the truth, even hard truth about someone's sins. So it's very important that even when it's hard, that we show that love of God by speaking the truth, even hard truths about sin to people. I mean, that could be really hard to approach someone about that. But Daniel had a very unwavering commitment, and so he didn't have a problem speaking these hard truths. So in verse 17, Daniel's response to the king may have appeared a bit like disrespectful. But unlike the Babylonian wise men, Daniel would not interpret the words for personal profits. He says, "I don't care. I don't need what you have, but I'll make this interpretation for you." And Belshazzar, kind of unlike his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar, had not humbled himself. So what happens in between verse 17 and 22 is he goes into explaining what had happened to Nebuchadnezzar because of his own arrogance, because of Nebuchadnezzar's own arrogance. And the kingdom was taken away from Nebuchadnezzar because of that. And he kind of Daniel goes into the specifics of that, and he says, "And you saw what happened. You knew what happened because of Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, and you still refused to humble yourself." So he says, "You've not humbled your heart. You knew all of this." And Belshazzar only refused to bow to the true God, but he also was desecrated the holy vessels from Jerusalem temple by using them to celebrate pagan gods. So he says, not only did you see what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, you've kind of ignored it, you've still put yourself above all of this, you haven't humbled yourself before God. Now you're taking these very holy things that came from the temple of God, and you're desecrating them. You're using them for something that's very very sinful, and celebrating these pagan gods. He's saying that you've exalted yourself. You know, you've lifted yourself up. You think you are above everybody else. And that this term kind of has been used as a synonyms for a wicked person. So he's calling Belshazzar a wicked person. And he says that you have exalted yourself against the Lord of the heavens. So what made Belshazzar's actions of exalting himself rather than humbling himself so wicked was that he purposely had done this against the Lord of the heavens. So he saw it. He knew what God could do. He saw what happened to Nebuchadnezzar because Nebuchadnezzar was arrogant and didn't humble himself. And he still just does it. He purposely does this against the Lord of the heavens, and that's what Daniel's telling him. And I mean, you know, imagine being someone who was a captive and you tell all this. Now, keep in mind, he's not even read the inscription yet. He's telling Belshazzar this all prior to reading the inscription. So he's kind of getting his hard truth out right here in the beginning. And before, you know, he's giving him the hard truth before even he tells him what God's hard truth is. So he's telling him all these things he's done. And then he talks about the vessels, and he says that these were sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar brought to Babylon from the Temple of Jerusalem, just kind of reminding him that he was using them in his drunken orgy as containers to drink wine and offer libations to pagan gods. And then he points out the kind of pagan gods that Belshazzar was worshiping, which was of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or understand. And if you think about, this could probably very well be, we could probably think of people or a group of people, or, you know, even like people of, like famous people, or the people who really think a lot of themselves, and they are worshiping all these other things besides God, and that's kind of what Belshazzar was doing. So there's still plenty of people just like Belshazzar in our lives today. You know, and maybe we don't do it to the extent that Belshazzar's doing. Maybe we don't lift ourselves up like he does, but there's probably times when people around us or ourselves, you know, feel pretty good about ourselves. Something we've done. And I think we're all probably guilty of worshiping things other than God, money being a big part of that. And so it's really no different. He gives these things names. But you know, it's just like today. There are things that we worship that are not God, that are pagan gods, in a word. And then he said, "You have not glorified the God who holds your life breath." And so he tells him that not only have you exalted yourself, have you lifted yourself up, are you kind of worshiping yourself and all these other things, you also haven't glorified God for anything that's happened to you. He also mocked, dishonored, disgraced, and debased God when he should have praised, extolled, revered, honored, magnified, and worshipped him. So he's had a lot of probably really great things happen to him. He's a king. He has all these things, and he's kind of just mocking that. He's, you know, taking these things that came from the temple of God and using them for things that are not godly at all. And then it says, then he kind of calls out that God is the reason that you're alive. He's the reason that we are all alive here to experience this life. And he says God breathed into the first man the breath of life. And as Job 12:10 reminds us, the life of every living thing is in his hand, as well as the breath of all humanity. And sometimes we forget that our lives are dependent on God. If God had not created man, had not breathed life into man, we would not be here. We owe everything that happens to us, everything that's around us, to him. And we are all dependent on God and his decision as to when he requires our souls from us. So, you know, he's saying the person who holds your life in his hand, you're just mocking him. And then he talks about who controls the whole course of your life. And it doesn't necessarily indicate that predestination rules out all of human decisions. We make our own decisions. God leads us. He gives us the tools and the knowledge that we need, but we do still make our own decisions sometimes. But rather, this refers to the destiny. The Bible exhorts us, in all your ways know him and let him direct the course of our lives. So prior to any of like reading the description or talking about telling Belshazzar what the inscription means, Daniel's kind of already given him these hard truths. He's not holding back. He's telling him exactly what kind of things he has done wrong, and that he knew this could happen, and that he knew he should humble himself, and that he should glorify God, but instead he glorified himself. So even before doing what he asked, Daniel was telling him those hard truths and letting him know that, what you've done is sin. This is sin. And, that can be hard to point out what someone is doing is sinful, but, that might be the only way that we are showing God's love and we are leading others to Christ, is to kind of point out, like, hey, you're not supposed to be doing this. I know you're not supposed to be doing this. Change these ways. And then in the next set of verses, we will see that we'll see the importance of speaking the truth, that sin brings judgment. So Daniel's kind of pointing out all of Belshazzar's sins, what he's done, and why he's going to have to endure this judgment. So, Sharon, if you'll read that third set of verses.
Therefore he sent the hand, and this writing was inscribed. This is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighed on the balance and found deficient. Perez means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians.
Alrighty, so we've gotten to the point where Daniel has read the inscription, and now he's going to interpret it. And so Daniel not only had to have this courage to tell Belshazzar about his sins, now he's going to have to tell him about the judgment that he's going to have to face because of those sins. And so all of Daniel's words to this point in front of a frightened king and his guests were preliminary, like I said. Technically he wasn't called there to kind of call Belshazzar out for his sins. He was there to tell him what this inscription meant. But they were necessary to the purpose for which Daniel had been summoned, to interpret and explain the handwriting on the wall. There's some debate on like the meaning of the words, and if they refer to like coins, or it's like Hebrew type things. But all in all, the message remains the same. And so, although the Bible scholars still debate the meaning of the words today, Daniel was able to give the interpretation of the message. So he starts out with Mene. Mene is a form of the word to number, but also to use in the sense of fixing a limit to. So, as he said, as in someone's days are numbered. And Daniel was informing Belshazzar that the days of his kingdom were numbered. And the days at this point had run out. God was bringing his kingdom to an end. And indeed, that very night, a coalition of Medes and Persians conquered Babylon. And so a historical thing behind this, I also got this from the podcast, is that at this very moment, the Medes and the Persians, when he had this party, the Medes and the Persians were like surrounding Babylon and were about to conquer it. And he thought he was so powerful and could prevent this from happening that he just threw a party. He said, we got enough food to sustain us for all these years. And Belshazzar thought nobody could take him down. He thought nobody could conquer him. So really, he was kind of at the height of arrogance. He was very arrogant about how important he was. He was totally worshiping himself. So just keep that in mind, that he threw this party knowing that all these people were around him wanting to take over Babylon. And then the word tekel, which means to weigh and then to assess. And Daniel informed Belshazzar, you have been weighed on the balance and found deficient. And obviously by that he means you are very sinful. You have been weighed to God's standards, to his moral standards, and you have been shown to be very wicked. You do not measure up to God's standards. And then Peres, which Parsons is actually the plural form of, it means to break or to divide. And thus it came to mean to be destroyed or to be dissolved. Daniel informed Belshazzar, your kingdom has been divided. And that very night, Belshazzar would be killed, and the Medes and the Persians would take over Babylon. So you see the fall of Babylon. So he says, your days are numbered. You do not measure up to God's standards. Even though you saw what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he acted this very same way, and your kingdom's going to fall, and it's going to be divided. And so, so Daniel had to approach the king, give him this very hard truth about the kind of person that he was, and then tell him what was going to happen. So the message on the wall said that the reign of Belshazzar would soon come to an end because of his arrogance and lack of character. Imagine being in Daniel's position, knowing this was a message to be delivered. It must have taken tremendous courage and conviction to do so. At the same time, imagine being in the position of the king. He also had a choice. So, just think about the type of conviction that Daniel had about God's message and about telling others when they are not doing as God has asked, and having to be that bold witness for God, even when it meant saying something that was very hard. And that's what Daniel did, and he knew he was a captive already. He knew that could possibly mean he'd get killed, but he felt so convicted about being truthful about God, what God wanted others to hear, that he said what needed to be said. And as we finish up, we always have these 3 things to think about, to live out during the week. And the first thing is give permission. Ask a trusted Christian friend or mentor to speak honestly with you about any inconsistencies of lack of integrity in your life. And that would be hard to give someone that permission to tell you what you are doing, what they see as very unchristian-like in your life. And then prepare in prayer. Pray for boldness to speak the truth and for wisdom to speak with grace about sin and its consequences. And then speak up. Who have you avoided having a difficult conversation with? Make an appointment to speak to this person soon, which could be even harder. Sometimes, we can deal with what someone says about us. Sometimes it's harder to go to someone else and tell them where you see the inconsistencies in their lives and the lack of integrity in their lives. But that also helps to show a godly type of love, because if you are truly concerned about their soul and where they're going in the afterlife, you may need to point out those difficult things. Churchill had the task of delivering truth when truth wasn't necessarily what the people wanted to hear. In a similar way, Christians are called to speak against popular notions of the day. All right. So let us pray as we finish out. Dear God, thank you for bringing us here this morning, God, and to remind us that sometimes we have to tell those around us the truth about their actions, even when it's hard, God, and that sometimes we need to listen to the truth of our actions, God, even when it can be hard. Just help us to go throughout this week, God, and just to be a witness for those around us, to be a testimony to those around us. In your name we pray.